I'm just gonna say it. I don't think Istaroth is the god of time. I know, that's a really spicy meatball to swallow given that everybody seems to be in agreement that she is the god of time. I mean, there's definitely enough evidence to support the idea, because like even her scribe refers to her as the ruler of time, so is that it? Is that the end of the argument? Like, case closed, done deal, pack it up, it's over, boys? Well, no, this is a theory video. I don't know what you expected. I can't just end it here. But I'm not even gonna try to refute her powers over time. I don't really want to. It's just that I don't think there's only one time god. I think there's at least 4, each one ruling over a different aspect of time, and Istaroth is merely one of them, which makes her a god of time, not the god of time. And the difference kinda matters. So in this video, I'm gonna make my case as to why I think Istaroth is one of several time gods, and then we're gonna investigate just which aspect of time belongs to her. Now, you guys know the drill by now. Timestamp citations and links for further reading are downstairs in the description, while notes and corrections can be found in the pinned comment. But there's no time to waste with time gods waiting about, so let's get right to it. If you didn't already know, Istaroth also goes by the name of Kairos and is suggested to be one of the primordial one's 4 shining shades. But fun fact, she's never outright been called a shade, although for simplicity's sake, we're just going to assume she is one because it ends up making the most sense in the end. Now, most of what we know about her comes from the book Before Sun and Moon, found in Enkanomiya, which also mentions her by both of her names, as well as the epithet, the Thousand Winds, a title that is also mentioned frequently in Mondstadt in places like the Thousand Winds Temple and carvings on sundials throughout the region. This same book also calls her the ruler of time and the god of moments, and it describes several phenomena within Enkanomiya that she is responsible for, like the Sin Shades. She's also mentioned in a few other places, such as A's second story quest, where she's suspected of helping the Electro twins plant the sacred Sakura, and she gets another mention during Aranyaka, where Aranyaka calls her Ad Oblivion. Now, we're going to talk about all of these things in depth later, but I think that the best way to get to know Istaroth is through one of her fragments. Specifically, Venti. Venti is most likely a fragment of Istaroth, as he is described as a single thread of the Thousand Winds in his 3rd character story, implying that his relationship with the Thousand Winds is a direct one. He seems to be one of the Thousand Winds that Istaroth is made of, and Venti paints a very peculiar picture of what Istaroth seems to govern. While many can make an argument that Venti has a lot to do with time in general, Venti has more associations specifically with death and the afterlife. For example, when Xiao reached his limit and was about to die, it was Venti who kept death at bay for him through music, not Zhongli, which is who you would expect because Xiao is one of his yaksha, and if all archons could, prevent that kind of death or calm the soul or whatever, then why would he not do that for his own, adeptus? Then, during Winelesefest, he specifically said he brought back the winds from the far-flung past, but all the people within the memories he brought back are probably dead. Like, Crepus is confirmed to be dead, and Razor's parents are assumed dead, and no one knows what's up with Kaya's father, but statistically speaking, he's probably also dead. And speaking of memories of the dead, think back to Venti's first story quest. What was it again that we did with him? Right, we retrieved the spirit of a deceased adventurer, and then Venti presumably guided that spirit back home. And how fitting is it that Venti is so heavily smothered in the symbolism of Orpheus, right down to that special magic lyre given to Orpheus by the god of prophecy himself, Apollo. And Orpheus is best known for the myth where he travels to the underworld to bring a soul back to life and fails. And after Orpheus is killed, torn apart by women for reasons that vary depending on the source, his lyre is then taken up into the sky and made into a constellation, which is something that is shared with Venti's constellation. And like Orpheus, Venti probably can't actually bring the dead back to life no matter how associated with them he is. If he could, then he probably would have chosen to revive his friend, the unnamed bard, instead of reforging his own body into the bard's image. And all these little associations between Venti and death don't stop there. You know that kinda crack theory that's really popular in the lore community that says in order to get an animo vision, you gotta have a dead friend or family member? Well, that might not actually be too crack, because the associations with death and animo or wind go far beyond the animo archon himself. For example, during Winelesefest, Venti says that the people of Mondstadt believe that the wind can bring back the soul and preserve memories. He says this in reference to dandelion seeds, which can only be gathered by applying anemo to them. And fun fact, dandelions are also known as fairy clocks because they open and close under predictable conditions. So we've got clocks, time, seeds, and anemo application. It's almost like this was intentional. Now, the thing about seeds, which is one of the features that dandelions in particular are very famous for, is that for a non-perennial plant, seeds are a harbinger of death. So like in the case of dandelions, once they've successfully released their seeds, they will start to wither and die. Mostly because the seeds are considered their method of reproduction, and the whole point of the plant and the fruiting part of it is to reproduce, and then after it's reproduced, it's actually fulfilled its life purpose, so that's why it dies. But the memory of that plant in the form of its genetics is what's carried on through those seeds, which can then be planted and create new life based on the old one, thus creating a cycle. And this is thematically perfect because one of the most common ancient phrases to find around Mondstadt is seeds of stories brought by the wind and cultivated by time. Stories brought on the wind will bloom into legends in due time. And this makes Venti out to be some kind of Charon-esque figure with the wind who leads the souls of the dead to the god of time, Istaroth. And this seems to be a pretty common belief system throughout Mondstadt, even if they don't necessarily recognize Istaroth as the god of time anymore and just kind of worship time and wind together. For example, there's a passage in the Lost Prayer for the Sacred Winds which reads, "From the winds we have come, and with the winds we shall go. Never ever grieve for me. 'Tis but my flesh and bones which rest in the soil. My soul has become one with the thousand winds." This is explicitly talking about dying and then their soul being carried by the wind to the thousand winds, which is Istaroth. Now, you might have noticed that throughout this section, I haven't talked much at all about rebirth or future or creation or anything like that. I've mostly been hammering on the whole death part because that's the evidence that's there. But how can you call someone a god of time or the ruler of time if they're only associated with endings and with death? You kinda can't, which is why I think Istaroth isn't the god of time, simply a god of time, the god of the end of time, the god of death. But trying to prove her status as a death god just by looking at Venti isn't exactly fair. We should really look beyond this single fragment of hers to, some more aspects of her. The first thing worth noting is another one of Istaroth's epithets, the Tokoyo Okami. Okami just means god in Japanese, so the word paying attention to here is actually Tokoyo, which is a reference to the Tokoyo no Kuni, a realm from Shintoism. It's not technically an afterlife or the underworld or anything, but it is a kind of spirit realm that's frequently conflated with the underworld. Depends on the myth and the source, right? But it's also associated with the border between worlds or the period of twilight between day and night, which is really fitting since Enkanomiya, which is also called Tokoyo, kind of floats in this limbo zone between the living realm of Inazuma and the Abyss, which I guess is the underworld. However, I am leaning more into this whole underworld interpretation for a couple of reasons. So the name Tokoyo is also shared with the deity from Shinto mythology known as Tokoyo no Kami, a name meaning the eternal god, which is another title that is shared with Istaroth. This god was represented by the larva of a Japanese swallowtail butterfly, so like a caterpillar. If that seems a little bit irrelevant to you, it's really not. See, Istaroth has another name, which is Kairos. Traditionally, this means the moment of opportunity, but it can also be the name for the moment where the shuttle passes through the threads of a loom. And a loom is what you weave on, and you know what's really good at weaving? Caterpillars with their silk. Because, what did you think their little naptime blankies were made out of? Spit? No, it's silk. They weave those. And not only are they fantastic spinners and weavers, but in order to attain their final form of a butterfly, they have to experience a type of death, where they dissolve most of their body into a goo that reforms around these undissolved imaginal discs to create new butterfly parts. And what's really funny about this is that in cultures around the globe, butterflies represent the souls of the dead. So you lose the original body and come back as a soul, a butterfly's soul. Just look at things like the Chinese folktale of the butterfly lovers, or the Japanese tale of the white butterfly, or the Greek myth of Eros and Psyche, whose name literally means soul, by the way. And surely if you're playing an anime-style game, you've probably watched at least one anime where the dead come back as butterflies, right? Like, even Genshin does this. Just take one look at Hu Tao. I mean, she's full of butterfly symbolism, she guides the souls of the dead, and she runs a funeral parlor. She's covered in butterflies. And as another fun fact, butterflies love spider lilies. These flowers are heavily associated with death, as evidenced by their nicknames like corpse flowers, and you tend to see them used as symbols of death, so it is no surprise that Hu Tao sports a few. The dendrobiums in Inazuma are also a reference to these flowers, and they grow wherever blood is spilled. But what you might not know is that in Enkanomiya during Evernight, you can see a ghostly white variety of spider lilies surrounding this grave for the sun child Risutayosu. And speaking of souls of the dead, Enkanomiya is full of a phenomenon called sin shades, which are self-aware ghost-like phantasms created by Istaroth. They're basically like memory imprints of people, like snapshots. And the term shade in Greek mythology literally refers to a ghost in the underworld of Hades. And incidentally, these sin shades also go by the name Eidolon, which literally means ghost or phantom. So she's got all these weird little connections to souls of the dead and weaving. And her name refers to a specific time when you're weaving something on a loom. And if you think about a loom in this game, what's the first thing that comes to mind? It's probably the Loom of Fate. That's the name of the Abyss Order's secret plan. It's the thing that Dainsleif says we have to reweave at the end of the game. And it's also this locked traveler character story, so you know this is important. But you know what's also Greek and weaves fates? The Fates! These are the Morai, three sisters known as Clotho, the spinner, Lachesis, the allotter, and Atropos, the cutter. These powerful ladies are destiny incarnate, spinning the fates and lives of every mortal on Earth. Clotho spins the threads of life, so she is the creative force. Lachesis decides how much thread is used, thus determining how long a mortal's life should be. And Atropos is the one who cuts the threads, witnessing the end of everything. So if Istaroth governs death the way I have suggested, then she's the one who collects these threads of life after they've been cut. She is Atropos, and if lives are just a series of moments, then she becomes the keeper or god of moments. These are the seeds, the souls of the dead that are carried by the wind to the god of time. But this implies that there are three gods of time, now doesn't it? Istaroth may be Atropos, but who would be Clotho and Lachesis? Are they shades as well? And if they are, what about that mysterious fourth shade? How about we play a little game of cards? So a couple years ago, I wrote a theory based on an interview with Hoyoverse where they said that artifacts were based off of tarot cards and William Blake's poetry. I'm going to link the interview in the description box if you're interested, but I mentioned this old theory of mine because it's relevant to Istaroth in particular. As you know, artifacts are split into 5 types: flower, feather, sands, goblet, and crown. And each type has something that they represent. So it's the flower of life, the feather of death, the sands of time, the goblet of space, and the crown of reason. Now, I am using the original Chinese here because I have no idea what the English localization team was thinking for the sands and goblet, because Ionothem refers to the geologic record, while the original Chinese is referring to the emptiness of the sky, and those are two very different things. Now, each of these artifact types correlate directly to one of the 4 suits of the Tarot's minor arcana, with the last type likely being represented by the entirety of the major arcana, or at the very least the magician card, since Hoyo calls this one out by name in their interview. They also mention the elements associated with each tarot suit and match them to the symbols from Blake's poetry. Now, I apologize for the wonky translation here, but to quote, the inspirations for the artifacts were tarot cards and the poems of William Blake. First of all, there is a card in the tarot called Magician, which appears with the Holy Grail of Water, the Coin of Earth, the Staff of Fire, and the Sword of Wind, symbolizing the 4 elements. Also, in William Blake's famous poem, Auguries of Innocence, symbols such as sand, flowers, and robin feathers appear, representing infinity, eternity, and judgment. It is the inspiration obtained from the above 2 things that determines the flower of life, the feather of death, the sands of time, the cup of emptiness, and the crown of reason. So the crown here is reason or logos, and if you paid attention to anything going on during the Narzissenkreuz world questline, you'd remember that the sword of reason is a tool possessed only by one whose will is equal to that of the world, the one who has the authority over that world, also known as the primordial one, who, incidentally, also had a crown. Plus, in both physics and philosophy, logos represents the human mind and our ability to perceive the world and recognize its existence. This is partly why I think it can encompass the entirety of the major arcana, but that's, whatever. So that's the major arcana. What about the 4 suits of the minor arcana? Well, the Flower of Life artifact is most likely represented by the Shade of Life, a shade that we only learned about recently from the Fontaine Wind Glider. She is responsible for creating Egeria, and she's likely the shade that helped the Primordial One recreate life on Earth, a la Before Sun and Moon. This is most likely the artifact related to the Tarot's Wands suit, as the wands are traditionally made of wood and typically show flowers or leaves growing on them. Wands are associated with the element of fire, which can be likened to the spark of life, as they represent creative energy, so I kind of want to recontextualize this shade as the shade of birth or creation, like the one that grants life. And I do want to take a second to point out that flowers grow from seeds, and if seeds are what Istaroth collects, then perhaps she's the one who passes them along to the god of life who plants them. And speaking of Istaroth, most people will automatically assign her to the Sands of Time, but this artifact type should be represented by the pentacles or coins, and that's the element of earth. And we know that Istaroth is the Thousand Winds, which should make her air, right? So consider instead that Istaroth might actually be the Feather of Death. After all, feathers allow birds to fly through the air, and in tarot, air is associated with the suit of swords, which is a weapon, which can kill people. The sword suit also represents words, thoughts, ideas, and messages, and a feather can be crafted into a quill, a writing implement, which can deliver thoughts, words, and messages, and so on and so forth. It kind of fits this whole bard thing going on with Venti too, right? And speaking of Venti, he sure does have a lot of feathers in his combat animations, doesn't he? And as I've pointed out in many of my videos, birds are very frequently depicted as messengers, couriers of dead souls, omens of death, or even the soul of someone who died. Just to name a few examples, we've got Judaism, where we see human souls taking the shape of a dove, and then in Egypt we see the dead turning into a bird with a human head called a ba. Aztecs then believed that some people turned into hummingbirds upon their death, and then the Finnish have the Siliantu, which carry away the souls of the dead, and many tribes in Africa also believe that a fully cultivated human soul will become a bird upon death. Birds are also the notorious messengers of the goddess Ishtar, also known as Astarte, who was the basis for the demon Astaroth, who Istaroth is named after. Birds are also known to be distributors of seeds, and some types of plants even rely on them to do this for them. So if the seeds of stories carried by the wind are actually souls of the dead carried by birds, even allegorically, this fits a little too well. And it fits especially well with another one of Istaroth's assumed epithets, Ad Oblivion. So during the Aranyaka questline, Aranyaka describes this as the wind that flows forever, the 1,000 winds that return to one. But on Earth is the stream, and the ubiquitous is the wind, everlasting and devastating. And then they go on to elaborate, saying that it's a thing that takes away dreams, and then they conflate dreams and memories, and then later they say that death is just a one-time loss of memory. So this Ad Oblivion is the 1,000 winds, which takes memories, and losing your memories one time is basically death. Now this Ad Oblivion title probably comes from Greek mythology again, because once you died in Greek mythology, you became this shady ghost thing, and then you were required to drink from the river Lethe, whose waters would make you forget your life on Earth. If you didn't do that, then you could not be reborn. And Lethe means oblivion, which means that if the 1,000 winds is ad oblivion, or rather to oblivion, that means that it takes you to the river of oblivion to drink the waters of forgetfulness and return to the cycle of rebirth. That means Istaroth passes the seeds along to the Shade of Life, who then helps them blossom into flowers of life. This is the cycle of life and death. So, okay, if Istaroth is the Feather of Death, then what's going on with the other two shades, space and time? The way I see it, birth is when life begins, death is where it ends, and time, or the sands, is the space in between. The fact that the artifact for time isn't a clock, but instead is an hourglass which has a fixed amount of time inside, feels important to me. Like, this is your lifespan. It's fixed. When the sand runs out, you die. And this idea kind of appropriately fits the Tarot's Pentacles suit, since the sands of an hourglass are earth, because it's sand, and the Pentacles suit is really the suit of materiality, so like people, places, things, wealth, all the stuff in your life, right? So I think time here is more like a time span, which might be why they called it an eon in English, because that's also a span or measurement of time. So we have birth, time span, and death, making up a trinity of time and appropriately representing the concepts of past, present, and future. And that leaves us with the Goblet of Emptiness or Space, which is actually the most straightforward of all the artifacts, surprisingly enough. In fact, we've actually met this shade, and it's the sustainer of heavenly principles. Now I say this, admittedly a bit too confidently, because the Chinese character used for the goblet is the same one used to describe the Hersher of the Void from Hoyo's other game Honkai Impact, and it's very easy to see how the sustainer is heavily inspired by, or referencing at least, the Hersher of the Void in both visuals and abilities. Now the word used for void doesn't really have a great counterpart in English, which is probably why there's this really weird translation thing here. I think it's easiest to conceptualize this term as the ether, or like the vastness of the sky, since it means both emptiness and the heavens. And I have opted to translate that into space, and you know why? Because time does not exist without space, and space cannot exist without time. See, time is what keeps everything from happening all at once. Without it, the physical universe would be static and could not move, which means that nothing could interact with anything else. Time is basically a necessity for the physical universe, or space, to move. Without space, time does nothing, and without time, space does nothing. Therefore, you must have both for reality to be a thing, and that's why we call it space-time. And of course, none of space or time matters if there's no observer to witness it, and this is the Logos, the primordial one, with 3 shades for time and 1 for space. This may be why we see the proliferation of both triketras and the quaternary knots throughout the game. One represents the trinity of time, while the other the unity of space-time. Now, funnily enough, the sustainer has a quaternary knot on the back of her neck, and if you subscribe to the idea that the 3 shades of time are the moon sisters, then the one moon that we've seen, which is the Welkin moon, has a triketra on it. So that checks out. And this whole concept of the shades representing space-time brings me to Istaroth's most infamous deed, time manipulation. One of the most curious events in the entire game happens during A's second story quest, where Istaroth heeds Makoto's dying wish, what a coincidence, and helps A plant a tree in the past. This is the only instance of time being actively changed in the whole game, and Makoto even says that doing this, quote, frees the sacred Sakura from the clutches of the heavenly principles. How this actually works has bothered me for ages, and it got worse once Sumeru hit and we had 2 more cases of people being deleted from history, but without history actually changing, just people's perception of history. I kind of wrote this inconsistency off as the time god having more power or authority or something and kind of left it at that, but upon further reflection, Istaroth is most often referred to as the god of moments, and if you think about it, a life is really just a series of moments, so Istaroth rules over the complete collection of a person's moments. Metaphorically, if the shade of life creates blank pages, then the shade of time binds those pages into the form of a book, and then Istaroth fills those pages with words or moments, resulting in the completed book. And if a person's life is determined by their memories, then creating a new moment is really just giving them a new memory. And if you think about what Istaroth does, well, she cultivates the seeds brought by the wind. And what does A do? She plants a seed in Makoto's realm of consciousness, her mind, her memory. And if you're wondering how that does or doesn't change time, you did not watch Roosevelt's video all about how time works into that, and you should totally do that. And I also know that you totally didn't read the new in-game book Time Trekker, which you should. There are links below. But until you do, it seems like Genshin is operating with a type of time travel-y shenanigan known as eternalism or block time. Now, eternalism suggests that all time exists at the same time, meaning that no matter where you are in time, the future has already happened. Whatever choices you are going to make are ones that you have already made. That might be a little bit hard to conceptualize, so let me try to paint a word picture for you. This cube represents your life as a small model of space. This side is where your life began, and this side is where it ends. Everything that has happened or will happen exists simultaneously in here, but you, as the observer, can only experience a single moment. This sequential perception of moments is time, and it is what allows you to move through your life, through space. Which means that every instance of you exists at the same time within your life space cube. So if Istaroth, for example, decided to mess with your perception of time by giving you a memory, she can do so at any point within this box. And that memory will echo throughout the entire cube and permeate the space that is your life. It's a bit like if you had a cup of water and dropped some colored dye into it. This dye would spread throughout the water until it tinted the entire cup. The funny part is that you wouldn't even know that this happened because the dye is in the past, present, and future all at once. It doesn't matter how it got in there. This is what I'm calling an echo. And if this echoing through time thing sounds a little familiar, it's because it's from the book Before Sun and Moon, specifically the parable of the tree. The parable here is about a gardener who asked an incarnation of Istaroth for help with a magic tree that would take 500 years to grow. She tells him that if he plants a cutting of that tree, his, quote, one thought shall echo throughout eternity, and the tree will grow in an instant. And then the parable goes on to say, for it is the God of moments who is able to take seeds from this moment into the past and future. It's pretty fitting, right? I mean, this parable suggests that Istaroth might have given a seed, a memory, or even a dying wish, and then Makoto told A to grant it life. And so A did just that. She planted that seed within Makoto's realm of consciousness, which is not too dissimilar to the gardener's backyard, while the traveler bore witness to it. Now, I don't know whose thought echoed throughout eternity because it could have been A's or Makoto's or even the traveler's, but this action made the tree appear in the far distant past and the future. So the tree had just always been there. Time had always been as we had witnessed it. The only thing that had really changed is that A now understood how the tree came to exist. And this is what makes block time a little difficult to wrap your head around because it's really different from branching time. And I think that's one of the most common sorts of timeline alterations that we see. Like time moves in a straight line and then it kind of branches off into alternate realities as you make different choices. In branching time, the traveler would have arrived in Inazuma and there would have been no tree. And then they would have witnessed the tree being planted, and then when they returned back to Inazuma, the tree would have been there. With everyone also believing that the tree had always been there, but not you because you know the truth about the timeline being altered. Block time is a little different because, again, every choice you've ever made has already been made. It's already manifested in the past, present, and future. So that fits with the idea of the traveler arriving in Inazuma and having the tree already be planted, then witnessing it being planted and coming back and having it still be planted. And that is what makes block time special. It doesn't branch out and it doesn't loop back on itself. Just to further my point, while the traveler was in Makoto's realm of consciousness, time was said to be moving both forwards and backwards at the same time, and Makoto then claimed that she had lost her ability to perceive time, which may be because she's dead. But this is very block time-like, because all of her past and future seems to exist at the same time, but she can no longer observe her own life because she's dead, and therefore cannot perceive time in a linear way. Now, if I haven't lost you yet, I do want to touch on one thing, and that is how this incident differs from what Nahida and Wanderer tried to do when they tried to change the past. Now, full disclosure here, I don't actually know which difference matters the most because I can make a case for all of them, and it's possible that all of them matter in equal amount. So I'm gonna leave the final choice here up to you about which one actually matters or if they all do. So for the first difference, we've got to recognize that this realm of consciousness belongs to Makoto, who is dead, and it's also a physical space that exists outside of Teyvat, a place where time runs both forwards and backwards simultaneously. Now, Nahida and Wanderer were still in Teyvat when they tried to alter the timeline. So the location could be the difference. Now, the second difference could be that A created something, whereas Wanderer and Nahida tried to remove something. Now, if you create something in block time, then it will just have always existed, and you will know that because you can observe it. But something can't really erase something else in block time, because that would mean that you would never know that it was erased. It would have never been there from the start, so removing something then creates a paradox in block time, while creating something doesn't. So it could be the difference between trying to add something or trying to remove something. And this ties into the third difference, which is that the Traveler actually bore witness to A creating the tree away from Irminsul. Now, both Nahida and Wanderer leveraged Irminsul specifically to tamper with the world, but Irminsul cannot alter the mind of the Traveler, so it would be impossible for them to forget that Rukkhadevata or Scaramouche existed. But it would be possible for the Traveler to witness a tree being planted, created, and have that thought echo throughout time and shape reality. Now, this would tie into the idea that the Traveler is the designer of all, as stated in the Narzissenkreuz questline, and how Dainsleif claims that the loom of fate is theirs to reweave. It would mean that the Traveler is the one who has to witness something, and that you can't alter reality officially with Irminsul because Irminsul can't touch the Traveler. So again, it could be any one of these things, or it could be all three of them. And you'll note that I didn't actually list Istaroth as a variable difference between what Nahida and Wanderer did and what A did. And that's because if you think about it, Istaroth's involvement was really minimal. All she did was deliver a seed to A. A was the one who actually gave the seed life. And it probably wasn't Istaroth's thought that echoed through eternity. That said, it is very curious that she did decide to tamper with time at all, however minimal her involvement. Especially since this action of hers apparently led to this tree being completely freed from the heavenly principles. And since the heavenly principles are basically the natural order imposed on the world by the Primordial One, it makes you wonder why a shade of the Primordial One would try to, buck the system. I guess if I had to speculate on this question, since I'm the one who brought it up, I did mention earlier that there's this common theory that 3 of the Primordial One's shades are actually the 3 moon sisters, Arya, Sonnet, and Canon. And legend says that after a great disaster occurred, 2 moons fell from the sky, leaving the 3rd up there alone. Now, in some versions, all 3 moons died, and in other versions, 2 of them died, and the 3rd locked herself in her palace. Now, if the Primordial One had any involvement in this tragedy, it would provide the survivor, so Istaroth, potentially, plenty of motivation to rebel against the Primordial One out of revenge for her fallen sisters. Because we know she didn't bring them back, or else there would be 2 more moons in the sky, right? That's block time, baby! Although it's possible that she didn't survive, and what we're witnessing are just seeds that she's left behind. Now, while this next thought is a little on the crack side, it is possible that the Traveler is going to become the next Istaroth, or at least will share some traits with her. Actually, if the Traveler is gonna be the next Primordial One, which is more likely, and then inherit the throne of heaven as per their character profile story, then that means that they will create shades of themselves too. Well, potentially. The only real reason I say this is because of this name card called Traversal. It says that a Traveler shall experience 10,000 tales, and each shall form a part of the Traveler's soul. Now, stories, seeds, and souls are all synonymous, right? And that's very reminiscent of the lines all around Mondstadt that talk about the souls returning to or merging with the Thousand Winds. I've got no proof here, just vibes, and I think I'll leave it at that. This was supposed to be a short theory, and that obviously didn't happen, so, Anyway, let me just entertain you all while the names of my super supportive channel members scroll on by. So in talking about spacetime, I'm always reminded of light cones, and not just because they're in Honkai Star Rail, but because light cones have this really weird resemblance to Deshret's mausoleum. You thought you were gonna get through this whole theory without a single Deshret mention, didn't you? Well, too bad. But anyway, just put these side by side for a second and compare them. I mean, you've got the past and future cones on either side, and they've got this singular point in the middle, which should represent the observer, and then, between the pyramids, you have this crystalline eye, which, an eye observes things, right? I don't quite understand why Deshret designed his mausoleum to look like a light cone, but I do think it's interesting that he has this whole separating mind from body, and then the all minds merge into one thing with the golden slumber, and that's kind of reminiscent from that one line in Lost Prayer to the Sacred Wind that goes, "My soul has become one with the thousand winds." It's almost like he's trying to control the circumstances of his death. And come to think of it, we never really did figure out what this mausoleum was doing with all that red stuff in the sky, did we? Was it like trying to alter time somehow, or like reverse it? I'm not sure, but I do think about it a lot. Also, there wasn't really anywhere to put this, but while I did liken 3 of the shades to the Greek Moirai, so like the Fates, it's also worth mentioning that they have a lot in common with the Horai as well. So these are known as the seasons, and they're represented by natural time, not fate. So Thallo, one of the Horai, was the one who brings blossoms, so spring, and obviously kind of indicative of the shade of life, right? And then we have Oxo, who was the one who promoted growth, making her summer, and also the god of time, there's the shade of time, rather. And then we've got Carpo, who is the reaper, or the harvester, and therefore autumn, and also Istaroth. And the Horai, weirdly enough, were also deities of justice, although I don't quite know the reason for this overlap, and they were responsible for guarding the cloud gates of Zeus. And this immediately made me think of the sustainer of heavenly principles for obvious reasons. I mean, she is literally guarding a cloud barrier. It also seems like the Horai were executioners of the Morai's judgments in some myths too, which is kind of interesting, especially because Hesiod lists the Moirai and the Horai as sharing a mother, which would make them all sisters. Anyway, lots of food for thought to chew on here. I mean, I don't know if I convinced you of anything, but I hope you at least had fun today. So thanks once again to all of my channel members for supporting my nonsense, and thanks a bunch to you, little viewer, for watching. Take care now, bye-bye!